Not long ago, my friend, the playwright Anita Sullivan, sent me a copy of Poor Things. Naturally, I eyed it with trepidation because it looked rather literary, and despite being an author, I'm not much of a reader. I prefer Netflix, though I do watch with the subtitles on. But then she asked if I thought Poor Things could be classed as a young adult novel, forcing me to actually read the damn thing. Needless to say, I was hooked and suitably depressed that I would never achieve anything like Alasdair's mastery of storytelling. I can't draw as well as him either, though I've had a go because it's as close to an interactive presentation as I can get. So here's my impression of Candle and then Bell. Sorry about that. When I was done, I was a bit puzzled by Anita's questions. Why would she even consider Poor Things a YA novel? I mean, it's certainly not an obvious choice. But it did. I gave it some serious thought because, after all, I have written plenty of YA myself. But did that make me qualified to judge? What is a young adult novel anyway? I mean, at one time the definition was fairly simple. It was a normal book with less explicit violence, swearing, and sex. Well, that's certainly changed. I mean, YA publishers may be notoriously risk averse, but teens are a lot louder and more savvy than they used to be. I mean, have you read Hunger Games? That's not for the squeamish. The novel Tweak, for instance, uses the F word 139 times. Superb. Even sex is allowed so long as everyone promises not to enjoy it. Poor Things has little violence or bad language, and while Bella may be sexually voracious, there are no explicit bonking scenes. In fact, it's all rather tame compared with more modern YA fare. So, what other stumbling blocks to it being a YA novel might there be? It's usual for a YA novel nowadays to have a central character who is age appropriate. Poor Things has kind of got that covered as well. Bella is supposedly a kid in an adult's body, so by the law of averages, that makes her a teenager. And it's not even a new YA concept when you consider family movies like Freaky Friday or Big. True, I don't recall Barbara Harris ever becoming a prostitute. She's in the original 1976 film, for those of you too young to care. But Tom Hanks has a very problematic scene where his 13-year-old in an adult body appears to have spent the night making whoopee with co-worker Elizabeth Perkins. Well then, how about merit and pedigree? Alasdair Gray has accolades in spades, and there's a long tradition of claiming commendable old novels to be YA books, whether they have kids in them or not. Stuff like Last of the Mohicans, officially rated R for violence in the United States, Frankenstein, Ivanhoe, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Moby Dick, and anything by Charles Dickens. And to me, that's wishful thinking. Moby Dick, for instance, for all its worthiness, it's a total slog, and I vastly prefer the unofficial remake, Jaws, which does have children in it, even if it's a couple of them get eaten. As for Poor Things, despite being fairly modern, it's pretending to be an old work, just like it's pretending to be an unofficial remake of Frankenstein. Therefore, it is still fitting all the criterion for a YA novel. So far, so good. But does that mean it's a suitable candidate? At first glance, definitely not. I mean, its narrator is a bloke who works for the sanitation department in 19th century Glasgow. The language, in keeping with the setting, is old-fashioned. I mean, there's plenty of history, but it doesn't revolve around battles or explorers or earth-shaking events or any other cool stuff. It's about societal attitudes that have long changed, except in the USA. The feminist aspects are somewhat negated by the fact that it's written by a middle-aged man pretending to be another middle-aged man. It's got footnotes. Okay, so does Lord of the Rings, but that's not a positive. The promising Frankenstein vibe gets shot to pieces at the end, and before that there isn't a pitchfork-wielding mob in sight. There's no bodice ripping, and none of the romances are actually romantic. And so George Clooney and Julia Roberts are surely not starring in the movie version. And nobody gets a happy ending. This is certainly not a novel that lends itself to the TikTok generation's interests or attention span. And there's a bigger drawback than that. The author claims to have reproduced an uncovered manuscript that he believes is a true account. Only he hasn't, and he doesn't. The accuracy of this non-existent manuscript is hotly disputed by the man who found it in the present and the woman it's about in the past. Except neither of them exist either. Like, seriously? Like, surely young adults don't want a low-stakes version of Rashomon. Don't they all crave the one thing that they rarely get in these turbulent times, and that being certainty? To most writers and publishers, it's simply a given that teens want sound advice and a guiding hand. They don't. But it has led to one of the overriding tenets of what constitutes a young adult novel. That authors can leave the younger generation something worthwhile, a moral lesson, a fixed truth, a problem to be solved, and hints on how to do it. And at first glance, Poor Things seems to have a plethora of those tick boxes. History is worth preserving. Women should not let their narratives be shaped by men. The fight against social inequality, injustice and injustice is hard, and virtue is often its own reward. The world is full of hypocrites. Don't gamble. Religion sucks. It's all pretty standard stuff that kids already know. My 9-year-old sighs and says, "Such is life," when I try to pass on my wisdom, while my 6-year-old points out I don't recycle enough to lecture her. Maybe Alasdair Gray has nothing insightful then to say to teens after all. Admirable, in my opinion, but not very YA. But then I remembered a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald. "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." And then I remembered that Alasdair Gray was Scottish, like myself, and pieces fell into place. For Scots have a quirk that's woven into our culture and our history. It's called Caledonian antisygyny, and it was coined in 1919 by the literary critic G. Gregory Smith about Scottish literature. But it applies to the nation in general, and it equally applies to young adults. We are paradoxical in the extreme. Scots have been described as welcoming, insular, broad-minded, narrow-minded, racist, inclusive, mean, generous, violent, brave, pragmatic, impulsive, conformist, nonconformist, independent, tribal, bigoted, and enlightened. Why? Because we're all these things. This contradiction is expressed in every kind of form. Highlands and Lowlands, Glasgow and Edinburgh, Edinburgh's Old and New Town, Catholic and Presbyterian, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The list is endless. And this paradox is underpinned by three unedifying facts. 1. We prefer illusion to reality, especially when it comes to how we see ourselves. And we're quick not just to project that myth, but to actually believe it. Only deep down, we don't. Not really. The historical novelist John Preble, for example, dismissed our tartan-sporting, kilt-wearing, Highland-loving, shortbread tin frippery in one pithy sentence. No other nation has cherished so absurd an image, and none perhaps would accept it while knowing it to be a lie. That same contradictory mixture of pride tinged with embarrassment is put more succinctly by J.M. Barrie. There is no more impressive sight than a Scotsman on the make. We fool others by fooling ourselves. The typical Scot, like the typical teenager, often mistakes bluster for bravado and hopes nobody else will notice the difference either. 2. Because of this, we have a flawed and fragile hold on our identity. We want to be seen as fabulous and noble, often without putting in the hard work to actually achieve it. And we excuse our shortcomings by complaining we have been unjustly treated, misunderstood, and ignored. 3. Because of this, we have a chip on our shoulders you can see from space. This is, of course, true for all races and countries. Scotland just happens to embody it more than the others. But who else personifies these concepts? So much so it defines them in the eyes of all other ages? The young adult. And Alasdair Gray, I'm sure, knows it. In Poor Things, he is talking to the Scot and the teenager in us all. But he's much too perceptive to offer advice or to lecture, for neither Scots nor teenagers are great at listening. He offers something far more important and rewarding: alternatives. The entire book is based around contradictions and options. Christ Gray even creates his own nemesis to negate everything he says. Who is correct about the manuscripts, Alasdair Gray or Michael Donnelly? Who is telling the truth, Bella Baxter or Archibald McCandless? We'll never know. We don't know anything in this book. Is McCandless a misogynist? Some shitty 19th century incel? Or does he just feel so insignificant, unappreciated and unloved by a cold and calculating spouse that he retreats into fantasy? McCandless' story is more exciting, and as I've said, we prefer myth to reality. But we may even be irritated by the late intrusion of Bella's legend and ball-busting prosaic version. Regardless of which account you choose, however, both sides are identifiable to any teenager. It's he said, she said, and one of them is lying. Logic is firmly on Bella's side, and therefore our sympathy shifts. Myth is convincingly unmasked as lie, and we are confronted by a female heartily sick of having her story shaped by male insecurities. Yet you can't know for sure. You never can. That's life. That's the sad part, the confusing part, the teenage part. So what we do know is that women still have to overcome hurdles that men simply don't face. So if Bella is the one myth-making, let's give her the benefit of the doubt, because she deserves it. And that's how I imagine teenagers want to be treated. For me, that's the brilliance of Poor Things. Sure, it addresses all the concerns of a typical YA novel. One by one, Gray lines up everything kids want to rebel against, even if they can't be arsed. Inequality of race, gender and social status. The smugly deluded Elon Musks who mistake luck for talent and don't understand they've risen above the masses because shit floats. Religious fanatics unable to take responsibility for their own actions, whose half-hearted belief in a higher power allows them to be moral Nazis, claiming they're only following orders. Even God, and I love how obvious and contradictory that name is, has a distant father and cannot escape the social conventions that prevent him properly acknowledging his mother. All teens feel at some point that they are freaks. Awkward constructs, far removed from their parents and even most of their peers. Gray ties that in neatly with Caledonian Psyche. It's a long-running joke that people call Mary Shelley's monster Frankenstein, when in fact Frankenstein is the doctor who creates the monster. Gray understands that we are both monster and creator, badly self-assembled, without proper instructions, like one of those IKEA wardrobes that always leans a little bit to one side. Poor Things owes a similar debt to the great Scots novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We each struggle for control over ourselves with limited success. Caledonian Psyche, amplified, if you're a teenager, by raging hormones. Yet, rather than a solution, instead of instructions, Gray offers up a hero who learns to embrace her massive contradictions. In either version of Bella's story, she is powerful, yielding, naive, wise, callous, loving, manipulative, manipulated, compassionate, steely, fanciful, and practical. And what does it get her? The happy ending she deserves? No. Resolution? No. Bella gets dead sons and a sense that nothing she has done made any real difference. All she is left with is the vain hope that a better world is around the corner. A world that young people are still waiting for. One they are tired of waiting for. Gray knows the Scots. They endure by doing what they always do. Like Archibald McCandless, they will engage in another spot of reinvention. It's not too outlandish to say we're going through a minor new Scottish Enlightenment right now, this time progressive rather than practical. The young adults don't have that kind of weary laissez-faire. Like Bella McCandless, they must stumble along with nothing but a sense of wonder and a fuck you attitude to keep them going. Nothing is certain and they're on their own, except they're all in the same boat. And there is something beautiful and profound about that. In Poor Things, Alasdair Gray hasn't shunned solutions because he thinks there are no answers. It's because he knows there are so many, that it is up to the reader, adult or teen, to decide which ones they deem valid. So in the end, is it a young adult novel or an adult novel? Well, both, of course.